A foggy December afternoon, the atmosphere in downtown Cincinnati seems enveloped in a thick mist. Dark clouds are rolling in from afar, making the air feel heavy, as if rain could fall at any moment. But strangely, even though the rain never comes, the air remains damp, reminding everyone of the fragility of the unpredictable. The sound of car horns, the squeaking of the sidewalk beneath the hurried steps of pedestrians, merge into the relentless rhythm of life, never stopping. The smell of gasoline, the scent of fast food from the street vendors, the leather of new shoes, everything blends together into an unforgettable aroma, rich with the essence of this city's life. The crowded, bustling streets seem never to tire, much like the people here always rushing, always racing against time, with hardly anyone ever stopping to truly see what passes them by. Amidst this chaos, there is a man walking in strange solitude. He is unlike anyone in the crowd. JD Vance, with his simple appearance, yet still not blending in completely, walks through the street like a stranger, but there's something about him that makes people look twice. Vance isn't dressed in the sharp suit people are used to seeing him in when he appears on TV. There are no spotlights, no cameras trained on him. He is simply a man in a casual coat, hands in his pockets, with distant eyes, looking at something only he can see. Those around him, though they may not know who he is, can still sense that this man is not an ordinary one. He walks past old shops, where the faded signs and peeling walls go unnoticed by all. Abandoned e-bikes clutter the sidewalk, and no one cares. No one pays attention to the disarray. All of these things seem to merge as one, with Vance a man walking like a ghost among the crowd. And then, from the side, a voice rings out. A simple question, but it cuts through the crowded space like a knife. "Hey, can you spare $1?" A question Vance has heard countless times. He's lived in cities long enough to have seen countless people standing on sidewalks, holding out their hands for spare change. With questions like this, he's become accustomed to it. Usually he would just shake his head or nod and keep walking, never stopping. But this time, something is different. Something, though not clear, is enough to make him stop. He turns to look at the man who asked. This man is not like the homeless people Vance has met before. He's not begging or causing a scene. He just stands there, his eyes clouded, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a burden too great to bear. His eyes, wide open, aren't angry or demanding. They resemble the eyes of someone who's been beaten down by life for so long that he no longer knows what to expect, except perhaps a tiny bit of compassion. Vance notices he's gaunt, not just from hunger, but because the years of living on the streets have taken everything he once had. He's not wearing ragged clothes or showing signs of hardship in his actions. It's just the weary stance of a man who's been left behind. And in that look, Vance realizes this is not just a meaningless plea for money. Something in the man's voice made him stop. "What's your name?" Vance asks, his voice soft, not hurried, not trying to be polite or indifferent. He simply wants to know. The man, clearly surprised, raises an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. A second passes. Then he shifts slightly, his eyes showing disbelief, as if no one has ever asked him that question before. "Eddie," he replies, his voice hoarse, as if this was the first time in his life he's heard his name spoken calmly, not in mockery or disdain. Vance stands there, still not pulling out his wallet, no urgency in his gaze. He observes Eddie, not as just a homeless man, but as a person, a living being with a story, with a past. Vance can feel something deeper in Eddie's gaze, a sadness no one cares to acknowledge. Vance wonders, has anyone ever really seen him before? "Do you live around here?" Vance continues, not asking for an answer, but as if trying to create a space for Eddie to share if he wanted to. Eddie laughs softly, a dry laugh, with no joy in it, just the laugh of someone who has lost faith in life. "I live wherever," Eddie says, his voice dry. as if he has accepted everything life has thrown at him, no longer dreaming of a place to call home. At this moment, Vance no longer sees just a homeless man, but a person forgotten, caught in the whirlwind of an unjust life. Eddie, with that look, with that pain, is the image of so many out there whom society often ignores, who are never truly seen. Vance does not continue walking. He stands there, amidst the bustling crowd, amidst the curious glances, amidst the hurried footsteps. What will he do? Eddie looked at Vance, a gaze filled with unfamiliarity mixed with suspicion. He seemed to be wondering if this was a real conversation or just a brief interaction between strangers passing by. Vance didn't seem in any rush, showing no sign of pity or calculation. He simply looked at the man in front of him as if he were a real human being, not a beggar, not a shadow passing by in the eyes of others, but a person with a story, a past, and pain that not everyone is willing to listen to. "What do you do when you're not out on the street?" Vance asked, his voice deep, each word seemingly sinking into the air. He didn't just want an answer. He wanted to probe Eddie's soul, to understand why he had ended up in this situation, why he had become a part of the picture that society often overlooked without a second thought. Eddie didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, as if trying to recall something from his memory. Then, a laugh escaped him, not one of happiness, but the laugh of someone who was tired, confused by his own life. "What do I do? What else can I do?" Eddie replied, his voice full of sarcasm. "Do you remember the job I used to have? Plumber. I fixed pipes. Not the fancy plumber type, just the kind who does repairs in houses, fixing broken toilets, replacing busted pipes, changing leaky faucets." He sniffed, as though bringing up a past he wished to forget. "But now nobody needs a guy like me. No home, no place to stay. And when I did get a job offer, people said, 'You need an address, a phone number, something to prove you're not homeless.' And that's the end of that opportunity." Vance listened to those words, each sentence heavy. He understood that feeling, the feeling of someone always being left behind, the feeling of a person for whom every door is closed just because they don't have the right conditions to walk through. He had once lived the same way Eddie was living now, the feeling of a child growing up in poverty, with no opportunities like others, fighting with every step. He stayed silent for a moment, sensing the space around him, the people still hurrying by, no one stopping, no one seeing what was happening. It was just him and Eddie, two people, two worlds apart, but in that moment they were more alike than ever. "So, have you ever thought about getting out of here?" Vance asked, his voice still gentle but with certainty. Eddie looked at Vance, a look of doubt, as if his question was too distant, too unrealistic. He took a small step back, as though trying to avoid answering. "What? You mean you're telling me to go back home and look for a job? You think I can just walk into a job because you give me some advice?" Vance didn't rush him, didn't press him. He just stood there, observing Eddie, letting him feel that he was not just a passerby trying to get the conversation over with. "I'm not talking about getting a job right away," Vance replied. "I'm just asking if you've ever thought about looking for another chance for yourself." Eddie was silent for a long while, as though Vance's questions were challenging the beliefs he had clung to for years. "A chance?" Eddie scoffed, but this laugh had no sarcasm in it, just resignation. "What chance? Those things don't exist for me. People talk about opportunities, but no one ever offers anything real." Vance looked directly into Eddie's eyes, unwavering, with no fatigue in his gaze. He understood that people like Eddie had heard too many empty words, too many shallow encouragements. He wanted Eddie to see that there was something real that could help him change. And in that moment, Vance decided he would be the one to offer him a real chance. "I don't have much to give you," Vance said, "but I can give you a chance." A job, not a handout, but a real step forward. A chance to start over. Eddie looked at Vance, his eyes still filled with suspicion, but there was a faint glimmer of hope in them. "What are you talking about?" Eddie asked, his voice as though he were trying to understand. "You're going to help me?" Vance pulled out a small piece of paper from his coat pocket, carefully folded, and handed it to Eddie. "This is the phone number of someone I know. He's looking for someone to work. If you really want to change, you can call." Eddie looked at the piece of paper in his hand, but he didn't immediately take it. Part of him felt doubt, unwilling to believe in any promise anymore. He had become too accustomed to empty promises that never came true, but something about Vance's demeanor made him hesitate. He didn't look at the paper, but looked into the face of the man standing before him. Vance wasn't smiling, wasn't showing pity. He just stood there, calm, with no hint of exploitation or seeking attention. Eddie clenched his hand, then took the piece of paper. Inside, a strange feeling arose, a feeling of change. Eddie gripped the piece of paper tightly in his hand, feeling like an unexpected burden had fallen onto his shoulders. His eyes remained fixed on the paper, but his mind was spinning. Is this really an opportunity? Eddie wondered to himself. Everything he had heard before were just empty promises, but this time, something felt different. He could sense it in the way Vance stood there, looking at him with sincerity and seriousness, without any pretense or boasting. Around them, people continued to pass by, indifferent to the conversation unfolding right before them. A few in the crowd glanced surreptitiously, secretly pulling out their phones to record. Vance didn't notice, but Eddie did. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, as if he were just something for people to look at, something for them to record and forget. A man standing nearby, carrying a fabric bag, glanced over at them before suddenly speaking up. "Come on, what are you doing, JD? You planning to put on a show for the crowd? Just give him $1 and move on." The voice was full of sarcasm and contempt. The man's gaze mocked the connection between Vance and Eddie. Eddie felt like he was being treated as a joke, ridiculed with no one caring about the reality behind it all. Vance didn't respond. He simply stood still, his expression unchanged. He had heard those words before. They didn't distract him. But Eddie, on the other hand, felt a surge of anger rise inside him. He wanted to react, to slam his fist on a table, to shout that he wasn't a joke. But then another feeling overtook him. He no longer had the strength to argue. Everything had long since been beyond his control. Instead of fighting back, Eddie looked down at the paper in his hand, then turned to look at Vance. He didn't say anything, just remained silent, but his eyes seemed to hold a big question. "Do you really think I can change?" Vance nodded. There was no mockery, no pity in his gaze, only trust, a patience that couldn't fade. "I don't think you can change immediately, Eddie, but this opportunity can help you take a new step. The rest is up to you." Eddie swallowed hard, feeling like his throat was closing up. He had grown so used to people offering empty words of encouragement, but this time, things felt different. He looked down at the paper, then back into Vance's steady eyes. He knew that if he turned this down, there would be no other opportunity. And if he decided to take it, what would happen next? At that moment, Vance's phone suddenly vibrated in his pocket. He took it out and looked at the screen. "What's going on?" Eddie asked, his voice hoarse. Vance just shrugged, not looking at the phone, maintaining his calm demeanor. "It's just work," he replied simply. He looked at Eddie once more, then glanced back at the phone. "This number belongs to someone I know. They have a program to help the homeless, and if you really want to change, I think this is a good opportunity." Eddie could hear the words, but he didn't know how to react. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads. Every choice, every word, every decision in this moment could change his life forever. "So who should I call?" Eddie asked, still not fully trusting what was happening. He felt his hands sweating, not from fear, but from anxiety, confusion, and a flicker of hope that had suddenly sparked. Vance didn't answer immediately. He looked into Eddie's eyes, then slowly pulled out an old, worn phone. He handed it to Eddie. "You can call now," Vance said, his voice deep but filled with determination. "This is my number. If you don't know what to do, call me. If you want to find an opportunity, I'll help." Eddie looked at the phone, filled with doubt. He sighed, then reached out to take it. His eyes were filled with hesitation, but for a brief moment, he felt something inside him begin to shift. He clenched the phone in his hand, and for the first time in many years, Eddie felt that he was not forgotten. Maybe this wasn't the perfect opportunity. Maybe it was just a small door that he hadn't dared to step through. But at least it was a door open, and he had to decide. Do I have the courage to walk through it? Both of them stood still, a silence enveloping them, with no more of the noisy city sounds around. It was just the eyes of Eddie and Vance, a strange connection between two people not because they were alike, but because they had truly seen each other through a silent mirror. Then, in a brief but heavy moment, Eddie looked back at Vance, and in the end, he decided, "I'll give it a try." Eddie stood there, the phone in his hand feeling like a heavy weight, but for the first time in many years, it wasn't just a phone, it was an opportunity. This feeling, strange and suffocating, engulfed him like waves crashing onto the shore. Can I really do this? He wondered to himself. Throughout all the long years of living on the streets, he had never felt he had a real chance to change. Everything had always been a chain of failures. Every time he tried to stand up, something pulled him down. But this time, it felt different. Maybe it was because of Vance's gaze, the sincerity that required no promises, only actions. He glanced back at Vance, the man standing next to him, still silent, but his gaze never leaving Eddie. "Do you really think I can do it?" Eddie asked, his voice hoarse. The question wasn't for Vance, but for himself. Vance simply nodded. No need to say anything more. The answer was in his eyes, in the patience he had shown Eddie throughout the conversation. Eddie looked at the phone again. He didn't know where to start. He had heard hundreds of promises before, but this time, something felt different. This wasn't a promise from a charity, not a piece of paper with the name of an organization he knew would never call him back. This was a real person, offering him a chance. But did he have the courage to step past his fear and believe in it? His hand trembled as he touched the phone's screen. His finger skimmed over the phone number. A part of him wanted to give up, to walk away, to say he couldn't do it. But another part urged him on, as if someone were whispering that this was his last chance, one he couldn't afford to miss. "I can do this," he told himself, taking a deep breath and pressing the call button. The sound of the phone ringing in his ear was soft but full of tension. Each ring felt like a heartbeat pounding in his chest. This feeling was like standing on the edge of a cliff, with only one choice: jump and trust that something will catch you. Finally, a deep voice came through the phone, pulling Eddie out of his anxious thoughts. "Hello?" Eddie flinched. The voice was like a cool breeze on a hot summer day, a gentle call filled with expectancy. I want to apply for a job," Eddie said, his voice a bit hoarse but no longer trembling as it had before. The person on the other end was silent for a moment before responding. "Good. I hear determination in your voice. Come by here. We have work for you." It felt like a massive stone had just been lifted off Eddie's shoulders. He dropped the phone, a sense of exhaustion washing over him, but also filled with hope. This wasn't an empty promise. It was a real invitation, an opportunity he couldn't let slip away. He looked back at Vance, saying nothing, but his eyes lit up in a strange way, as if a small flame had been kindled in his heart. Vance just looked at him, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Good luck, Eddie." A simple wish, but it was a reminder that this was a real opportunity, and he was the one who would decide whether it would succeed or not. Eddie walked away, each step heavy but full of resolve. The sensation was new, as if everything around him had suddenly slowed down, as if the world was waiting for him to do something significant. He didn't know what would come next, but a part of him knew that no matter what, he couldn't turn back. Eddie walked through the streets, the city's lights shimmering ahead like a beacon lighting the path he was about to take. Each step was a decision, a confirmation that he was ready to try again, ready to start over. A little while later, he stopped, looking at his hand where the phone was still warm. He sighed, no longer filled with doubt. This was real, and he had stepped into it. He wouldn't let fear and doubt stop him now. And then, a voice called from behind, soft but cold, "I know you won't make it." The voice came from a stranger standing a few steps away. Eddie turned around, and the man was an older man, his hair graying, his face etched with wrinkles from the passage of time. His gaze was full of judgment, as if Eddie would never change. "Stop dreaming. Who do you think you are?" the man sneered, stepping closer. But this time, Eddie didn't stop. He looked into the man's eyes, and then, without saying a word, he turned away and walked off. The words no longer mattered. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. He wasn't living for other people's judgments. He was living for himself, for the opportunity he had chosen to seize. Eddie walked quickly through the streets, his steps no longer slow like before. Each step felt different now, no longer the weariness of a homeless man, but that of someone searching for something greater. He felt each beat of his heart, each breath coming faster. But this time, it wasn't out of fear, it was because of faith. Faith in an opportunity that not everyone gets. He didn't know where he was heading, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Not because of the criticism from those around him, but because Eddie himself had decided to see the light at the end of this dark path. It was a difficult decision, but once made, nothing could stop him. When he arrived at the door of the company Vance had introduced him to, he felt anxiety rise within him. The large door loomed like a wall between him and his opportunity. He stood there, gripping the old phone tightly, his heart pounding. Then, a strange thought flashed through his mind. If I don't step in, I'll never know. Eddie took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the vast space, the desks, the spinning chairs, and the busy atmosphere made him feel small. But it didn't matter. He had stepped in, and this was the first step of his journey. A middle-aged man looked up as Eddie entered. He glanced at Eddie, seemingly unimpressed, but there was no contempt in his eyes. "You here for a job?" His voice was cold, but not unfriendly. "Yes," Eddie replied, his voice still rough, but much more confident than before. "I want to work." The man was silent for a long moment, as if evaluating him from head to toe. "Do you have any experience?" he asked, his tone still indifferent. Eddie took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I used to work as a plumber. I worked in homes. I don't have much, but I can work hard." The man raised an eyebrow, not speaking immediately. During those moments, Eddie felt like an outsider in the room. No one knew who he was. No one understood what he had fought through to be here. But he didn't give up. "I can learn," Eddie added, his voice full of determination. Finally, the man stood up and walked over, his eyes no longer as cold as before. "All right, I'll give you a chance. Try working here for a few days. If you can do the job, we'll hire you." Eddie could hardly believe his ears. A real opportunity, not an empty promise, but a genuine chance to work, a chance to prove himself, to start over. "Thank you," Eddie said, filled with emotion. He couldn't say anything else, just nodded vigorously, not only thanking the man, but also thanking himself for daring to step through that door, for facing what had once terrified him. A few days later, Eddie started working at the company. Each day, he grew more accustomed to the job, to the new colleagues, to the work environment that was completely different from what he had known. His hands, though still rough, no longer felt helpless like before. He could feel himself changing. Step by step, he was building a new life, not from the money he earned, but from his perseverance and constant effort. But things weren't always smooth. One day, while working, a new colleague named Mike looked at him with suspicion. "Hey, you're the homeless guy, right?" Mike asked, his tone mocking. The question hit Eddie like a slap to the face. He felt like a criminal, as though his past was still hanging over him. He wanted to snap back, to say that he wasn't just the shadow people saw, but then he stopped. He had learned the most important lesson in the past few days. Not everyone will understand your journey, and you don't need to explain it to them. Eddie just looked at Mike, said nothing, and continued working, not letting those words shake him. "If you want to see who I really am, wait until I succeed," he told himself. A few weeks later, when Eddie had become more stable in his work, he received a compliment from his supervisor. "You're doing a great job. We'll consider promoting you to a higher position." These words were like a refreshing rain in the dry season of Eddie's heart. He couldn't help but smile softly, not because of the praise, but because he knew this was the moment of true change. He had started over, and no one could take this opportunity away from him. And one evening, when he returned to his shared room, Eddie stood before the mirror, looking at himself. For a long time, he realized something important. I am not the person of the past. I am the person of the present, and I won't let anyone dictate my life. In the mirror, the image of a man standing firm, no longer trembling from fear, no longer worried about what was to come, reflected back. Eddie smiled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt he deserved the opportunities he had seized. Eddie had been working at the company for almost 3 months. Each day was a challenge, but with every passing day, he felt more and more confident. The work wasn't always easy, but he started to find pride in what he did. His colleagues began to change their perception of him. They no longer saw him as an outsider, but as a reliable team member. Still, there were moments when Eddie felt he wasn't enough. Every morning when he woke up, he wondered if he truly deserved what he had. He had a job, a place to stay, but sometimes in the quiet moments, an unease crept into his heart. "Can I keep this up?" he asked himself. Then, one afternoon, while Eddie was working at the workshop, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from an old friend, someone who had known him when he was living on the streets. "Eddie, it's me, Mike. I heard you're working at a construction company, right?" Mike's voice came through the phone. Eddie recognized the voice, and a little anxiety stirred within him. Mike was a person he had known during his time on the streets. They had spent years together, but since Eddie decided to change, he had rarely kept in touch with old friends. "Yeah, I'm working there," Eddie replied, his voice slightly hesitant. "What's up?" Mike was silent for a moment before speaking again. "I need help. I have nowhere to stay, no job. I heard your company is hiring. Could you help me out?" That question felt like a slap in the face to Eddie. He remembered the hard days when they were both in similar circumstances. He understood that the feeling of having no place to turn, not knowing what to do next. But the question made him uneasy. He had worked so hard to change, to move away from his dark past, and now he was facing someone from that past. "Can I help Mike without falling back into what I've left behind?" Eddie wondered. Eddie was silent for a long time, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to help his friend, but he was worried that doing so might pull him back into the past. He had worked so hard to escape. "I'll help you, Mike," Eddie finally said, deciding to reclaim his strength in his weakest moments. "Come to the company tomorrow. I'll talk to them about you." The next day, Mike came to the company. Eddie saw him standing at the door, looking out of place in his old clothes, just like when they first met. But what was different was that Mike had a worried look in his eyes, a look that Eddie had once seen in himself. He walked over and put his hand on Mike's shoulder. "I'll help you. Just show me you want to change." The company had a trial program for new people, and after a short time, Mike was hired. However, things weren't always easy. Mike faced challenges. Some colleagues still looked at him with suspicion, and there were times he wanted to give up. But Eddie didn't let Mike step back. He stood by Mike, not to lecture him, but to show that he believed in his friend's ability. You can do it, Mike. Just don't give up, Eddie reminded him, his words a huge encouragement. He had been through those moments, and he knew that sometimes people just need someone by their side to remind them they're not alone. Every day, Mike gradually proved his worth. And when he completed his first task, one of the supervisors came to speak to Eddie. Hey, Eddie, your friend is doing pretty well. I think we can keep him. These words made Eddie feel proud. He had not only helped Mike get a job, but also proved to himself that change was not just about himself, it was about those around him. He wasn't the only one who could change. And more importantly, he realized he hadn't abandoned anyone, not even those who had been a part of the dark past he had tried to leave behind. A month passed, and Mike had gradually stabilized both his job and his life. He found a place to stay, no longer wandering the streets, and their relationship, though it had started with a simple act of help, had blossomed into a true friendship. Through helping Mike, Eddie had not only changed his own life, but had also created a change in another person's life. That evening, when Eddie returned home, he stood before the mirror in his small room. For the first time, he looked into the mirror and didn't see a homeless man, didn't see a failure, but saw a man who had overcome himself, had found a purpose in life, and would never give up. This is who I am, Eddie said to himself, a gentle smile spreading across his face. A person who changes not just for themselves, but for those around them.